The great hall of the banqueting house was abuzz with anticipation. It was February 24th, 1624, and the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and the rustle of fine fabrics. At one end of the hall, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, stood next to a table, his presence commanding and his jewels glinting in the candlelight. Beside him, Secretary of State George Calvert held a portfolio of documents, his face a mask of concentration. Charles, the Prince of Wales, sat next to George, his father's heir, looking both nervous and determined. The hall was packed. Earls, bishops, judges, and barons filled the benches, while members of Parliament, MPs, crowded the scaffolds lining the walls. The room was so full that even some members of the Privy Council had been told there was no room for them. James Hamilton, the newly appointed Lord High Steward, stood at the door, checking the guest list with a stern expression. The King, James I, was not there. He was purportedly ill, suffering from a fierce rheum cough, and had remained at Theobald's, his country retreat, but his absence only added to the tension. For years, James had treated Parliament as a mere formality, a tiresome constitutional necessity. Now he had asked for their advice on a matter of great importance, the Spanish marriage negotiations and the fate of the Palatinate. George, sensing the weight of the moment, began to speak. His voice was clear, but he started with an apology. "I am not used to speaking before such a learned and grave assembly," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But I will do my best to share with you the truth of what happened in Madrid." The MP leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. George gestured to Secretary Calvert, who began to read a letter from the King to Digby, the English ambassador in Spain. The letter outlined the diplomatic quagmire they had faced, the endless negotiations, and the growing frustration. The room was silent, the only sound the rustling of papers and the occasional cough. George then took over, his voice gaining confidence. He spoke of the slights and deceptions they had endured in Madrid. He described the clandestine meetings in coaches and gardens, the efforts by Spanish divines to convert Charles, and the traps laid to humiliate them. He shared private conversations, revealing the duplicity of the Spanish. "We must be friends and part all the world between us," Olivares, the Spanish king's favorite, had whispered to Charles. "Let us make a match presently and not call for the assistance of the Pope." George's tone was caustic, a great offer indeed that would swallow all. He told of the Infanta, the Spanish princess, who was dazzling and delectable in the hot Spanish sun, but who was quickly snatched away. Charles was allowed only a brief, formal visit, his words stifled by the presence of Spanish guards. George recounted the growing realization that the Spanish were delaying the match, trying to deny it through endless prevarications and new conditions. The MP were entranced. They had been denied access to the most anodyne government papers, yet here they were, privy to the most secret diplomatic correspondence. The room buzzed with excitement. One MP noted that things never came hitherto to any men's knowledge had been shared openly. George's speech was a sensation. Within days, transcripts were circulating in London, and the printing presses around St. Paul's were churning out copies of his vivid account of the Spanish labyrinth. The Duke, once a controversial figure, was now hailed as a hero. He was called the preserver of the nation and the darling of the multitude. People flocked to see him, unable to go or ride or stand in his gates for press of people to behold him. The mood in the House of Commons was electric. MP began to debate the king's request with a newfound sense of importance. They urged the king to break off the treaties with Spain, to commit to assisting Protestant allies on the continent, and to wage war if necessary. Sir John Eliot, an ally of the Duke, called for quick action. "War only will secure and repair us," he declared. While Parliament reveled in its newfound influence, the government, now seemingly in the hands of Charles and George, began to reshape James's foreign policy. Diplomatic maneuvers were underway, and the Venetian ambassador reported that Henry Rich, one of George's allies, had appeared in Paris. The possibility of a marriage between Charles and Henrietta Maria, the French princess, was being explored, despite the countless difficulties it presented. Meanwhile, fears of a Catholic backlash intensified. The Privy Council ordered the city authorities to conduct secret searches, looking for suspicious persons. James, however, remained secluded at Theobald's, claiming to be too ill to meet with government officials. George, growing increasingly frustrated, began to speak more openly about the king's indecision and his unfavorable interpretation of the speech to the joint houses. As the days passed, the king's condition seemed to worsen. He appeared lost, indecisive, and often wept. The Venetian ambassador noted that he now protests, now weeps, but finally gives in to whoever he sees. The once mighty monarch was in the grip of a debilitating melancholia, while the nation looked to his son and the Duke for leadership. The stage was set for a new chapter in English history, one where the power dynamics were shifting, and the fate of the nation hung in the balance. James, the King of England, seemed to be losing his grip on reality. His behavior became erratic, swinging between moments of deep depression and sudden bursts of anger. He would swear, weep, and laugh unpredictably, and when pressured to make important decisions, he would pretend to be ill. His obsession with Spanish donkeys, which he insisted on importing, showed just how distracted he had become from his duties as king. The relationship between James and his favorite, George Villiers, also known as the Duke of Buckingham, grew increasingly strained. George, who had once been James's closest confidant, was now more focused on building his own power base and influencing the young Prince Charles. James felt betrayed and often lashed out at George, alternating between moments of affection and resentment. He suspected that George was more interested in the future King Charles than in him, and this only deepened his feelings of isolation. In the meantime, Parliament was busy discussing the proposed marriage between Prince Charles and the Spanish Infanta. The committee, which included George, debated the potential religious and economic impacts of an alliance with Spain. Charles, who was now more confident and active in politics, worked hard to gain support for his position. He even visited the House of Commons, which was unusual for a royal, to listen to their deliberations and provide additional evidence that supported his claims against Spain. Despite the efforts of Charles and George, James remained hesitant to commit to any decisive action. He was an old king, and the thought of war terrified him. He worried about the financial burdens and the potential loss of trade, which would affect his already strained finances. When Parliament presented their advice, urging him to break with Spain and support the Protestant cause, James listened but refused to make a firm commitment. He thanked them for their advice, but insisted that the final decision was his alone. Parliament, frustrated by James's indecisiveness, continued to push for a clear stance. They proposed raising funds for a potential war, but James demanded an exorbitant amount, £900,000, which was far beyond what they could realistically provide. The situation became so tense that George, feeling desperate, sent a letter to the king threatening to distance himself if James didn't resolve his conflicting positions. The deadlock was finally broken when a moderate MP, Sir Benjamin Rudyard, suggested a compromise. Parliament would provide around £300,000 to defend against any immediate Spanish threat, with a commitment to cover ongoing costs if war broke out. This proposal was accepted, and a deal was reached. On March 21st, an ailing James, along with Charles and George, attended a sermon on divine love. Afterward, George defended his actions to James, who publicly praised and commended him, solidifying George's position as a key figure in the new anti-Spanish policy. James declared his trust in George, emphasizing that George had aligned himself with the people, a move that seemed to bridge the gap between the king and Parliament. On March 23rd, just before the Easter recess, Parliament officially declared that the king would break with Spain. The news was met with jubilation, and the streets of London were filled with bonfires and celebrations. The tension that had been building for months finally released, and a new chapter in the kingdom's history began. On a warm August day in 1624, the Globe Theatre, a favorite spot for Londoners, was buzzing with excitement. People were streaming in to watch a new play called A Game at Chess by Thomas Middleton. The play was a clever one, with characters as chess pieces and the stage set up like a chessboard, but that wasn't what made the crowd so eager. The real excitement was in the hidden meanings and the guessing game it offered. As the audience settled in, they saw the ghost of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, standing center stage. He looked around in amazement, asking how he had ended up in a place that had escaped his influence. His servant, Error, lay at his feet, and when Ignatius kicked him awake, Error described a grand game of chess between the Black House and the White House. To the audience it was clear. The Black House represented Catholic Spain, and the White House was Protestant Britain. The play was full of clues that the audience loved to decipher. For example, there was a fat bishop, who many recognized as Mark Antonio de Dominis, the Archbishop of Spoleto. He had been welcomed to England by King James in 1616, but was later found to be secretly in touch with the Vatican. There was also a bawdy scene where the Black Knight, likely a reference to the Spanish ambassador Gondomar, asked for his chair of ease, a clear nod to Gondomar's anal fistula. The characters were carefully chosen to represent real people. The White King was obviously King James, the White Knight was Prince Charles, and the White Duke was George Villiers. The Black King was Philip IV of Spain, and the Black Duke was the Spanish minister, Olivares. But the identity of the White Queen was a bit trickier. James's wife, Anne of Denmark, had died 5 years earlier, so some thought it might be Elizabeth, Charles's sister, who was known as the Winter Queen. The plot thickened when the Black Knight, the master of the play, talked about enticing the White Knight to the Black House, a clear reference to Charles's journey to Madrid. The play also touched on the idea of a universal monarchy, hinting at Spain's ambitions to rule all of Europe and spread Catholicism. One of the most sensational parts was the character of the White King's pawn, whose doublet was black underneath. People speculated that this might be Lionel Cranfield, who had been deposed as Lord Treasurer, or John Digby, the English ambassador in Madrid. The play was a hit, and even though it dealt with sensitive matters of state, it somehow managed to avoid censorship. Some thought it must have had the backing of high-ranking officials, maybe even Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham. When the Spanish ambassadors complained to King James, he was furious and demanded to see the playwright, Thomas Middleton, but Middleton never showed up. James could only reprimand the actors and order the play to be shut down. Meanwhile, life for the Spanish embassy staff in London was becoming increasingly difficult. They faced mockery and even physical attacks, and their mission to arrange a marriage between Charles and a Spanish princess was stalling. Despite the challenges, they were determined to keep the talks going. Spain was deeply afraid of war, as their treasury was in a dire state, and they needed to avoid conflict at all costs. To achieve this, the Spanish embassy focused on removing George Villiers from power. They tried to turn James against his favorite by suggesting that George was plotting to marry Charles to a French princess, and even trying to take the throne. James was initially confused, but soon became angry, vowing that if the accusations were true, George would face severe punishment. The Spanish envoys, including Don Francesco and Father Maestro, continued to feed James with damaging reports about George, including scandalous allegations of George's behavior in Spain. They claimed he had tried to seduce Olivares' wife, and had been involved with a diseased prostitute. These rumors spread quickly, adding to the tension. Adding to the drama, a young courtier named Arthur Brett, who had been exiled by George, returned to the king's court. Brett's patron, Lionel Cranfield, was a powerful critic of the war and a supporter of the Spanish match. George saw this as a threat and moved quickly to have Cranfield investigated and impeached by Parliament. The swirling rumors and political intrigue finally came to a head on St. George's Day, April 23rd. James, feeling overwhelmed by the chaos, erupted in anger. It was a day of contrast, celebrating the Order of the Garter and reflecting on the day he had knighted George Villiers. The king was torn between his loyalty to his favorite and the pressure from his advisors and the Spanish envoys. The political chess game was far from over, and the fate of George Villiers hung in the balance. The royal carriage waited at the gatehouse of St. James's Palace, ready to take King James along with his sons Charles and George to Windsor for the Garter ceremony. But just as they were about to depart, the king instructed George to go on a slight errand, which meant he couldn't join them. George, sensing a snub, asked what was wrong. James burst into tears, declaring himself the unhappiest man alive, feeling betrayed by those he loved. The scene was unfolding in front of everyone, and George, standing at the carriage door, started to cry. He protested his innocence and demanded to know the charges against him. But the king closed the door and ordered the coachman to drive off, leaving George to watch the carriage disappear into St. James's Park. Feeling dejected, George walked to nearby Wallingford House, where he went to his bedchamber and refused to talk to anyone. Later that day, John Williams, the Lord Keeper and a leading member of the pro-Spanish clique, came to visit. George had previously pressured Williams into supporting him, and now the Lord Keeper came as a friend to offer advice. At first, George rejected Williams, but after some effort, the Lord Keeper managed to get into George's room. George was lying on a couch, refusing to move or speak. Williams, who was also the Bishop of Lincoln, didn't offer religious comfort. Instead, he gave George a stern talk. The snub from the king, Williams said, was a sign from God to mend his relationship with the king before it was too late. He warned George that some people were trying to turn the king against Parliament, and might even get George locked up in the Tower. Williams urged George to go to Windsor and show the king his loyalty. George listened, and, according to Williams, decided to act. He rushed to Windsor to be with the king, and stayed by his side constantly. A few days later, Charles thanked Williams for his advice and asked him to reveal who was plotting against the king and George. Williams was cautious, saying he only knew that some people in the Spanish ambassador's house were causing trouble. Charles, not satisfied, threatened Williams to give more information. Williams, fearing for his safety, admitted that he had been meeting the Spanish ambassador, Don Francesco, in a tavern. Francesco had told Williams about an English Catholic priest who was close to the Spanish. Williams hired a man to kidnap the priest, and when Francesco found out, he begged Williams for help. During their meeting, Francesco revealed that he was trying to turn the king against George. Williams wrote down everything Francesco said and presented it to Charles, saying he had caught the viper and her brood in a box. Meanwhile, the Spanish ambassadors were trying to convince the king that George was plotting to remove him from power and let Charles rule. James was so upset that he drew up a list of questions for his ministers and counselors, including George, to answer under oath. George was warned by Charles to cooperate and not show any discontent. The interrogations took place a week later at Theobald's. Some accounts say George was kept on his knees for 2 hours, as James accused him of acting imperiously. Other accounts describe a more emotional scene with James asking, "Ah, Steenie, Steenie, wilt thou kill me?" George denied the accusations, saying that if he had planned to remove the king, Charles would have known and stopped him. James backed down, but George demanded a full investigation to clear his name. James, fearing the situation would escalate, had his privy councillors swear to George's innocence. Despite this, tensions between George and the king remained high. George wrote a defense of his actions, arguing that he had always acted with the king's approval, and that Parliament was a crucial part of governance. The king, however, seemed to have mixed feelings, and their relationship suffered. In mid-May 1624, George fell ill. He had always been prone to illness, and was treated by the king's physician, Sir Theodore Turquet de Mayerne. The illness was so serious that rumors spread that George had been poisoned. The king was deeply worried, and sent food to help George regain his strength. George was eventually taken to St. James's Palace and then to Greenwich, but he suffered a relapse and had to return to Wallingford House. James visited him, showing great concern. The illness didn't stop the parliamentary work, and the house was guarded to control access to George. Some thought George was mad, while others believed he was under house arrest. George, however, slipped out of London and went to Newhall, his house in Essex. From there, he wrote a letter to the king that would change everything. George finally made his way back to court in mid-June 1624, almost a month after falling ill. Though the king welcomed him with open arms, it was clear that George's health had taken a toll. His face was pale, and he looked much thinner, a stark contrast to the robust figure he once was. The political world was in a state of uncertainty. Parliament had been suspended by the king on May 29th, and the chambers of the Palace of Westminster had fallen silent. James was in a foul mood, criticizing the subsidy bill and hinting at constitutional violations. The Spanish envoys, still in their embassy, were trying to prove George's treachery. They presented James with books and articles that allegedly confirmed their claims, but James, not wanting to strain his relationship with George, ignored their demands for another audience. John Digby, the former ambassador to Madrid, was under house arrest. George, during his convalescence, had helped draft charges against Digby, but the Privy Council's investigation was inconclusive. Digby continued to fight for a fair hearing, but with Parliament suspended and the king on his summer progress, his efforts were met with delays and stonewalling. Even a request to visit his sick mother was seen as a ploy to cause trouble. By July, Digby's position was bleak, and he was forced to consider reconciliation with George. Lionel Cranfield, George's other main rival, had been in prison during George's illness. The king, still supportive of Cranfield, agreed to his release but banished him beyond the verge, a symbol of his fall from grace. Cranfield's brother-in-law, Arthur Brett, made a desperate attempt to regain the king's favor, but his efforts backfired, leading to his arrest and imprisonment in the Fleet. With his immediate threats neutralized, George focused on re-establishing himself at court. He paid off his doctors and prepared a feast at Burleigh on the Hill to celebrate his return to health. The menu included venison, game, fish, and delicacies like muskmelons and Colchester oysters. His energy and ambition returned, and he was eager to push forward with the political strategy he had developed with Charles. The focus shifted to sealing a marriage between Charles and the French princess, Henrietta Maria, and negotiating a military alliance with France to help retake the Palatinate. The French ambassador, the Comte de Tillières, was recalled, and the Marquis d'Effiat, a friend of Cardinal Richelieu, took his place. George welcomed d'Effiat warmly, arranging feasts at Windsor and New Hall. At Windsor, George shared a secret with d'Effiat. He revealed that if the French match failed, it would not only affect the balance of European power, but also lead to his personal ruin. George even asked if Louis XIII would offer him protection. D'Effiat responded sympathetically, suggesting that his own future was at stake as well. George's candor, while risky, had a positive effect. It established his sincerity and raised the stakes of the negotiations. By taking d'Effiat into his confidence, George suggested that failure would result in James breaking with France and aligning with Spain, a move that could shift the balance of power in Europe. George's Thanksgiving feast for his return to health was held in late July at Burleigh on the Hill. The celebration included a masque written by John Maynard, setting a triumphal and optimistic tone for the upcoming negotiations. The negotiations proved challenging. In late June, George received a visit from the secretary of Count Mansfeld, a German mercenary hired to retake the Palatinate. Mansfeld was being held in Paris, and the French were hesitant to commit to a joint mission until the marriage between Charles and Henrietta Maria was finalized. Louis XIII, eager to match the Spanish demands, insisted that James suspend penal laws against English Catholics. Despite these obstacles, George's persistence and skillful diplomacy began to pay off. D'Effiat described George to King Louis as the unchallenged ruler of England, with James loving him deeply and Charles looking to him for happiness. Even Louis, despite George's scandalous liaison with his wife, was impressed and began writing to George directly, addressing him as Mon Cousin. George's return to court marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life and in the political landscape of England. His influence over the king and the prince was stronger than ever, and his efforts to secure a French alliance and the Palatinate were gaining momentum. As he looked to the future, George was determined to use his position to shape the destiny of his country and ensure his own place in history.